Hey everyone, Dr. Steve here. You're going to love this interview I recently did with Pastor Greg Strawbridge of wordmp3.com on my book, The Return of Christendom. And if you're interested, you can get the book at a special discount rate of 50% off by clicking on the link below. And we also want to give a huge shout out to the sponsor of this video, and that's the maker of this beautiful fighter flare flashlight. One of the best things you can invest in for your protection when the lights go out is this 6-in-1 beauty here. It comes with a 3,000 mAh solar powered recharging battery. It's got a high and low beam light that you can see from miles away. It has an emergency strobe light. It has a compass. It has a wire and rope cutter, an emergency glass breaker hammer, and a high-powered military-grade magnet. Absolute powerhouse. So amazing. And best of all, as a Turley talker, you'll get 15% off the new 2020 model before they sell out. But supply is limited, so don't wait. Click on the link below and get your super awesome fighter flare flashlight today. And enjoy the interview. God bless.
Steve has developed a ministry in the last few years of analyzing political events from a conservative point of view. And Steve, welcome.
Oh, thanks, Greg. It's always great to be with you.
Yeah, tell me about your current Turley Talks organization and what you do, and then we'll talk about a new book that you have out.
Yeah, the Turley Talks is it's an LLC that's dedicated to analyzing current events in light of what I like to call super awesome conservative trends. For conservatives to have hope in the world, that's one of the biggest challenges that I see just myself, getting up in the morning, reading the headlines and the like, especially from conservative commentators. And the doom and gloom that I was encountering over the last several years is just, it's nauseating. Everywhere we look, the world's falling apart. There's, 50 different gender options on Facebook. While it is certainly true that things at one level are getting worse, I thought it was a very myopic way of looking at the world. I thought if we could bring to bear a wider perspective, we may actually see there's some stunning things going on in our favor that reflect a thoroughly faithful, conservative, Christian vision of life, conservative religious vision of life that's actually growing in our midst. And there's a whole wing of scholarship called post-secular scholarship that's dedicated to analyzing these trends. So what I've basically done is I'm more or less a mediator between this post-secular scholarship and the wider conservative audience there to tell them, no, indeed, things are moving in our direction in astonishing ways. It's complex since they're moving also in the other direction. But if you only see that, then I think you're missing the big picture. So that's what I post 2 videos a day on.
Yeah, great. And how would people get that information?
They can go to my website, turleytalks.com, or they could just go punch in my name, Steve Turley, in YouTube, and they'll find my YouTube channel, Dr. Steve Turley, there.
Yeah, that's Turley with a U, by the way.
That's right.
As opposed to an I or an E.
Right.
Yeah, so and what qualifies you to be the kind of person that can talk about this stuff intelligently?
Yeah, great question. Yeah. Right. Well, without getting into the whole question of professionalization and the like, I'll leave it at that. I found myself in this very same situation, to be quite honest with you, several years back, 10 years ago or so. As a confessional Christian, I obviously believe Christ has the victory in all things. I believed that eventually things would go in our direction because Christ is King of the nations and the like.
Post-mill dude.
Yeah. Yeah. But I thought that was, 100,000 years from now. I didn't think it was anything even comparable was happening today. I thought everything was basically falling apart. So I was a Chicken Little. I get it. I'm trying to raise my kids in this world too. And it was when I was at Durham University doing my doctoral studies, starting around 2008 or 9. That's when I encountered this field of study known as post-secular studies. And it was part of my overall study of cultural anthropology. My PhD is in a cultural anthropological reading of the sacraments in the New Testament, baptism, the Lord's Supper.
Right. And by the way, we did talk about that on a
We
previous
did. We
podcast,
did.
which you can find
We
on
did.
Word MP3 under featured.
Yeah, that was a wonderful chat because I mean, obviously you're so versed in sacramentology and ritual and the like. So yeah, we got into all that, how rituals entail a whole cosmic vision, and it was part of that I learned what culture was, what society was, how it's inherently religious, how it's held together through something called the sacred, which the sociologist Durkheim at the beginning of the 20th century considered the rules, understandings, and goals that are absolute and inviolable, almost like social presuppositions, as it were, for any given culture. And so I started encountering all this amazing cultural anthropological literature as part of my doctorate studies. As part of that, I was blessed to encounter these studies known as post-secular studies. So I was putting that cultural anthropological research in two directions, one in the New Testament, but then the other in contemporary life.
And you have a new book that we wanted to talk about a bit. It's on Amazon. It's called The Return of Christendom, Demography, Politics, and the Coming Christian Majority. That's a fascinating title, The Return of Christendom. I was just doing a podcast yesterday with a friend, the lectionary podcast of Synaxis, and we discussed that question of Christendom as a phrase because it shows up in Martin Luther's great baptismal prayer, the flood prayer. The person who's baptized is to be brought dry and safe in the ark of Christendom, through the flood, dry and safe in the ark of Christendom.
Yeah,
so
it's beautiful.
Now you have a whole book on Christendom. A lot of Christians really don't like that concept. A lot of Christians think that the worst thing that ever happened to Christianity was Constantine.
Yeah, I know. and then I have a YouTube channel dedicated to trying to tell them, it's not all falling apart. It seems whether it's Constantine or Clinton, they're never happy. I don't know. I hear you. I don't like to be disparaging towards people. I do tend to think, and I'm not trying to be disparaging, but I do tend to think we have today sort of quasi-Gnosticism operating among Christians. I think there's a reason for that. So just for clarification, so Gnostics were very, very suspicious of culture. They thought culture, I mean, even the Platonists, Neoplatonists, Plotinus, they couldn't stand the Gnostics. Christians, of course, had a huge problem with the Gnostics. Gnostics really denied the value, generally speaking, of any materiality, anything that's material in nature, particularly the body. And so they put all their hope and their direction and disposition towards the spiritual, towards the non-material, that which doesn't change. What we would call in our classical terms, the eternally true, good, and the beautiful, but without a world that substantiates it. And I think, unfortunately, because Christianity has been so privatized over the last 100, 200 years in this secularized experiment that we've been in, that I believe, as the book says, is waning. It's finally met its demise. It's falling apart. Certainly in the Soviet Union, guys, it's collapsed. Instead, I think Christians unfortunately ended up reconfiguring their theologies around a very secularized vision of life, where there's really not much for us to do in this world. The secular state takes care of everything. Secular, institutions, NGOs, whatever, take care of everything. And really, in the end, all there is for us to put our trust in Jesus and to try to make other disciples. And anything outside of that is just, it's just not the point. It's not the point of Christianity. And I think we see this most especially in our imitation of the world, our imitation music, our imitation movies, you name our imitation fashion. Even our imitation Bibles. We're at my classical school at one of the buildings we rented several years back. They actually had what was called a skateboard Bible, and it was a teen Bible with kids, with a cover with a full blown, color skateboard jumping kind of, acrobatics. And isn't this cool? Isn't this neat? So ironically, when we throw out culture, all we end up doing is imitating what we have around us. Whereas Christendom really tried to offer, over the course of 1,000 years, a distinctively Christian vision of life that in many respects is responsible for virtually anything and everything that we value today.
But couldn't we just recover that if we had good tats that were good Bible verses?
Yeah, right.
I was in a restaurant once, and this young man server comes up, and he has on his forearm tattooed a passage out of Galatians, and it was, for freedom Christ has set you free. And I looked at him and I said, wow, is that a verse in the Bible? He said, yes. And I said, what translation is it? And he said, I don't know. I said, well, because some translations are really not that good.
Yeah.
Couldn't we recover Christendom just with better tattoos?
Right. Well, you would wonder that some people have that attitude. That's right. Yeah.
Well, what about your book? Give us a summary of the book, and then why should we buy it?
One of the best fruits of post-secular scholarship has been the tracking of the recovery of religion in our world today. Post-secular scholarship, it takes on something called the secularization thesis, which was dominant in the sociological departments of our universities in the West for a good century, and as a result, dominant in other spheres of influence as well in our humanities and the like. And secularization thesis basically posited the more educated and industrialized and technological a society becomes, the less religious it will be. Durkheim was actually one of the pioneers of this thesis, ironically. I think in many respects, the neo-Durkheimians, the ones who followed him, set him straight, as it were, saying, I think you missed it, Emil. You missed something going on here. But Durkheim actually believed that we were entering in a time where the classical traditional religions of the world were going to more or less disappear. They're going to go extinct, because he just saw the whole specialization and differentiation inherent in the rising modern world to just be overwhelming and unstoppable, which is, of course, itself ironic, because these same people tell us the modern world gives us more freedom than we've ever experienced in our lives out of one side of the mouth, and on the other side of the mouth they say, oh, and by the way, you can't do anything about it. You can't stop the modern world. It's going to come and it's going to redefine everything, and you're powerless to change it. So, am I free or am I not free? What's the deal here?
Yeah, it seems to me that just looking at the scientific revolution that's happened at the end of the 19th century, if you could lock everything up to the end of the 19th century, and everybody had their Newton, and everybody had their quadratic equations that they could do to figure out all motion. At the end of the 19th century, if you locked science right there and it never progressed, then I think the modern world would do away with all religion.
Right.
Because it's sort of, okay, the world is mechanistic, there can't really be a God from outside, and all of that kind of thinking. But of course, the problem was that was completely wrong about the natural world, right? And so very quickly, Einstein comes along and quantum physics comes along, and it's like the world is not at all like a clock. I mean, it's like a magic clock or something, and I don't know, a spirit clock or some kind of craziness like that, with quantum entanglement, and that's demonstrable in the actual scientific world. The world is not at all like what astrophysicists thought at the end of the 19th century,
You got it. And in many ways, modern society tried to ape that. Look at the Soviet Union, that it tried to create a massive worldwide factory, if you think it through. And it even had the hammer and sickle as its symbol. Gone is truth. Truth is gone. And instead, now all we have are scientific facts. And what we found, we have the studies now on this as well. Scientific facts are every bit as manipulable, given your worldview and your culture and so forth, as anything else in the world. I thought Russia was actually a beautiful example of this return of Christendom and just the futility of this modern experiment. What I go over in the book is...
Are you colluding with Russia then?
Yeah, I'm colluding with Russia. Right. Especially now, right, with Iran and all. No collusions here. Just a happy guy in Delaware, just doing my stuff. But yeah, looking at it big picture, as it were, outside of current geopolitical issues, there's no question that what we saw in the Soviet Union was a model of modernity, at least a model. I think the secular West was another model. And
Yeah, that was the 1984 model of modernity.
1984 model, absolutely.
As opposed to the Brave New World.
Yeah.
We're the Brave New World, they're the 1984.
Exactly.
I guess I'd prefer the Brave New World version if I had for the choice.
That was Alexander Solzhenitsyn's argument at Harvard when everybody thought he was going to rah-rah the West back, I think it was in 1977. You can watch it on YouTube. They actually have the full hour address that he gave there. It was fantastic. And it's a speech called "The World Split Apart." And since he had been exiled from Russia, the Soviet Russia, everyone thought he was going to go rah rah Jimmy Carter in the West and the like. And he said, "No, actually, you guys have your own problems that are stemming from the very same root as the Soviet Union, and that's the modern secular world." Yeah. And I think it was his Templeton speech that said, fundamentally speaking, men have forgotten God. That's the fundamental problem. The fundamental problem is men have forgotten God, and therefore we've forgotten what it means to be human since we're created in the image of God. What post-secular scholars are so interested in is, why did secularism fall? Why is it falling, I should say? And then why is it that in its place, you think of Russia today, in its place, you've seen the rise of this institution that was supposed to die. So the Russian Orthodox Church had only about 7,000 churches in 1991 throughout the entire land of Russia. I mean, let that hit you. We're talking 11 time zones, and there are only like 6,000, 7,000 churches. I mean, we've got 6,000 or 7,000 churches in single states, for heaven's sakes. So they've only got 6,000 or 7,000 churches in the entire nation because it was so ravaged by 70 years of atheistic communism. Today, 30 years later, they're approaching 40,000 churches throughout the land. All the monasteries that had been destroyed are all open again. They had 1,000 monasteries during Tsar Nicholas. They disappeared under Stalin. Those 1,000 monasteries are back. And so what we've seen, what's so fascinating, is that the Russian Orthodox Church has risen to a position of prominence unlike anything we've seen since the days of the czars. And to me, that's sort of a symbol of what's going on all over the West right now in its own unique outworkings. We're seeing the fall of a modern mechanistic conception of the world. And in its place, we're seeing a return. And that's key. It's technically known as retraditionalization. We're seeing a return back to how we did life for 1,500 years prior to the modern world as a way forward.
I have a friend that moved to Lancaster from Russia, and he lived in Russia for about 20 years and worked. He grew up in Russia as an American whose father was a journalist, so he grew up in the Cold War context. He told me something that I thought was very interesting. He himself was converted to Christianity through the Russian Orthodox Church, and he said there have been more people baptized in Russia in the time period since the fall of the wall than in any other time period in all of history.
Wow. Wow.
I don't know if that, and I thought to myself, I said, well, are you sure about that? And he said, yes, I'm absolutely sure about that. You look at the millions of people. That has not come through in any way. I mean, CNN has not reported on that, I don't think, and certainly, and evangelical missionaries don't even talk about that. We talk about world Christianity. I think I've never heard that from anyone else. It is a striking thing. It goes quite consistently with what you're saying.
Yeah, and the confessional statistics seem to bear that out. So in 1991, when the Soviet Union fell, only 30% plus Russians identified as Christians. They weren't atheists, which is interesting. We found atheists only made up about 6% of the population. Rodney Stark talks about that in his book, Triumph of Faith, which is very fascinating because apparently the world average for atheists is 5%. So 70 years of nonstop atheistic onslaught gave us an increase of 1%. It's just crazy. So you had about 30 plus, I think it was like 37% or so that claimed to be Christian in 1991. Today, it's over 70%. It's just this massive surge in self-identification.
And how many people are in Russia?
Over 100 million, just over 100 mil.
Well, give us a quick summary of the book. Give us a one sentence, one paragraph, maybe summary of your book.
Yeah. So what I do is I look at two overall trends that are meeting together to create what I'm calling this return of Christendom. The first trend I actually look at is a demographic trend. And of course, I've been to your church, and you're on the front lines of this. I've seen your congregation. The demographic trend, very simply, is that conservative Christians are having children and secularists aren't. And scholars are saying we're starting to see a massive shift in the political, cultural sensibilities of the makeup, not just of the United States, but of the West in general. That's just the beginning of what's going to happen in the future. So I look at the demographic trends, and then I'm looking at the political trends that we're already beginning to see, particularly in Europe, Russia, United States, where world leaders are now coming out and saying the only hope for mankind is a return to Christianity. So I'm thinking particularly of Viktor Orban, for example, of Hungary, or Poland, where in November of 2016, just a couple of weeks after the election of Trump, they held a national mass. Poland's a very, very Catholic country. Over 40% of the population attends church every week. They're an astonishing example of faith in the midst of Europe. And they held a mass that was televised on live TV in the presence of the president, Andrzej Duda, who will most likely win re-election in a landslide this year, very conservative fellow. And the head bishop, the archbishop, dedicated Poland anew to the lordship of Jesus Christ in every area of life. And they prayed. You can actually see the mass on YouTube with English translations. I have some excerpts on my channel. If you look for it, just look like Poland, Christ is King, something akin to that. Mm-hmm. So these are just simple examples. In Georgia, you actually had a national election. I'm talking, of course, the nation of Georgia. You had a national election over whether or not they were going to take out icons and Eastern Orthodox curriculum from their public schools. The secular, more communistic party wanted to do that. The new kind of Christian nationalist party said no way, and they're known as the Dream Party, and the Dream Party won in a landslide. And so Georgians made it very clear we want to keep Christianity in our schools. So it's these little tidbits of information, I think, that are combining to create a return.
Now, isn't that underreported in the mainstream media too?
Yeah, they don't care. Well, they're still operating under the secularization thesis. So CNN, MSNBC, Fox is better, but Fox still has a little bit of the sense of, well, I mean, if you're modern and you're hip and you understand things, well, we're not going back. We're on our brave new world, and it's cool, and it's not as bad as we thought. And we'll still keep faith around as long as it's voting Republican or something like that. Not to be overly cynical, but in terms of actually understanding what's going on, it's more the alternative news sources. And I read a lot of European news sources. When I was in Verona, Italy at the World Congress of Families back in March of 2019, we were with Deputy Prime Minister Matteo Salvini, who has promised how did he put it? Not redeem, rescue Italy on behalf of Christ, or something akin to that. Wow. Just return back to their Christian norms. That's a theme that you're seeing with many of the nationalist politicians and candidates, because I see a connection between going back to the nation as well as going back to our religious traditions. They're very, very much intertwined. So you look around there, they're all starting their own sort of newscasts and websites and the like, so as to get this message more out there. But no, you're not going to get it in CNN. You have to go to these studies. You have to actually go to these dry books, in the library shelves at a university library to find a lot of the reports on this.
The Return of Christendom. It's available on Amazon and other places as well. I did know that there's an audio version of it as well. So if you want to listen to it, it's on Audible. Is that right? Audible?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. Very good. While I've got you here in our last few minutes, this will be the dessert section of our discussion. We've had some very interesting recent events with the relationship between the U.S. and Iran and Iraq. give us the Turley worldview on President Trump's actions against and in response to Iran's actions.
It's interesting. We're seeing a split in among Trump supporters. So I think Fox News demonstrates that well, with Tucker Carlson on one side and Sean Hannity on the other side. So on the one side, the Tucker side, you have this notion of, oh no, the neocons are taking over again. They've wanted a war with Iran for 40 years. They're finally getting it. They've convinced Trump. He's betrayed us. What's going on? We should be there in the first place. Let's get out and blah, blah, blah. And on the other side, you got the Sean Hannity of like, oh, they're going to get it now. This is an act of war, and whatever Iran gets from this point forward, they deserve, blah, blah, blah. So you've got one side that wants out, and you got another side that wants a little bit more in, as it were. I think, to be honest, I think it's deeper than that. I think it's a little more 3D, 4D chess on both sides, by the way, on both Trump's side and Iran's side. What I'm reading that I find most convincing here is that Iran wants to convince the world that war is inevitable. Iran wants to convince the world that war is inevitable, even although they have absolutely no intention of going to war with us. And the reason why they want the world to think that war is inevitable is because of the very crippling economic sanctions that Trump has placed upon them. And if you read the transcript from his speech to the United Nations in New York, right around actually impeachment time, right around when Nancy Pelosi was starting her impeachment circus, he said fundamentally, Iran has to be stopped because it represents an Islamic version of globalism. And so Trump, in many respects, I don't want to use the word war, but I guess I will. I'll use it metaphorically. He's at war with globalism in its three major forms: in its Western liberal form that we all know about, the secularization, Amazon, Coca-Cola, all that, the Obama kind of pseudo-liberal, neocon kind of culture. He's at war with that. He's at war with the Beijing-centered globalism through the Belt and Road Initiative that's trying to reconfigure the world order around Alibaba and TikTok and all the cool Beijing stuff. And he, as it turns out, is at war with an Islamic-based globalism, which we would know more about in our theological sense, that they are talking about post-millennialists, as it were. They believe in conquering the world through conquest and the sword in its most rabid form. And Tehran does seem to indicate that it wants to be at the forefront of that. They didn't like ISIS. They didn't like that competition. Also, ISIS is Sunni, Iran is Shiite. But they have military presence in Africa, throughout the Middle East and the like. So what I think is going on is it's a little bit of 3D chess. So I think Iran's trying to scare everyone into thinking they want war, so as to put pressure on European leaders, in particular, and Democrats in particular, to tell Trump, just give them their 160 bill that Obama had promised them, and let's stop these sanctions. Trump, on the other hand, I think there's a difference between shooting your way into something and shooting your way out of something. Every indicator that I see is the neocons are gone. John Bolton is gone. The neocons hate Trump, and he hates them. He's shooting his way out, and he's showing Iran that the more they want to try to expand in this Islamic globalism, the more he can take them out from sitting behind his desk. He doesn't need to employ troops to fight a war on behalf of neo-Wilsonian democracy. He's not interested in nation building. He's not interested, and he's not going to get bogged down. They'll protect their basic base interests, the military base interests. But outside of that, he's showing that you can do a lot of damage from Washington, D.C.
Always a pleasure to talk with you, Steve. Encourage people to go to Turley